The chair no one filled it was supposed to be a light-hearted reunion. A film festival in Venice. Warm lights, gentle breeze, cameras everywhere. Everyone was waiting for the two Hollywood icons to walk in, Keanu Reeves and Brendan Fraser. Hadn't worked together in decades. Not since that forgotten indie film no one talked about. But tonight they were the main event. Old friends, old stories. And maybe a new chapter. Keanu walked in first. Simple suit, no entourage. Smiled, waved politely, and took his seat on the panel stage. He didn't seem like a star. More like a man who just liked being around people who still believed in stories. The crowd whispered his name with a quiet kind of awe, but the chair next to him stayed. It's empty. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, a backstage assistant whispered something to the moderator. The moderator's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then he leaned into the mic and said, "We're just waiting on Brendan. He'll be joining us shortly." But Keanu already knew something was wrong. He looked toward the back curtain, his face calm, but his eyes searching. Not for the spotlight, not for the fans, but for his friend. Brendan Fraser had been waiting behind that curtain for 15 minutes. Not frozen, not stuck, just ... unraveling. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He pressed his palms together as if that might stop the tremble. But nothing worked. Not the breathing exercises, not the lines he had rehearsed. The soft reminders, he told himself in the mirror that morning. This was his first major interview in years. He had turned down dozens before. Red carpets, press junkets, film premieres. He wasn't ready. But tonight, he said yes because Keanu had called him personally. Just come. Keanu had said in that calm, steady voice, "No pressure. Just sit beside me. We'll talk. Nothing heavy." And Brendan had believed him. Until he saw the cameras, until he heard the crowd, until his past started screaming in his ears again. He thought he was healed. He thought he was ready, but the panic didn't care. He stood just behind the curtain, trying not to cry, trying not to crumble. And that's when Keanu stood up. It was so quiet in the audience that even the creaking of Keanu's chair echoed across the stage. No one knew what he was doing. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at the audience or the moderator. He just walked off the stage. The moderator blinked, confused. Someone in the front row pulled out their phone. A few crew members stepped forward. Unsure if something was wrong, Keanu brushed past them gently. He walked straight to the side curtain, and then he didn't pull it back. He stood there, silent, still present, on the other side. Brendan Fraser felt it. He didn't hear Keanu's footsteps. He didn't see his face, but he felt something. A shift. The panic didn't leave, but it paused. The voices in his head quieted. Just enough for him to notice the calm, and then Keanu whispered, just loud enough for Brendan to hear, "We don't have to go out there. Not if you're not ready." Brendan didn't respond right away. He felt his breath catch in his throat. The weight of all those years of being forgotten, of being mocked, of being broken, sat heavy on his shoulders. And in that moment, Keanu's silence was louder than any applause. Brendan finally turned around. His eyes were red. His voice cracked as he said, "I'm scared, man." Keanu didn't flinch. Double quotes, "I know," he said. "But you're not alone." It wasn't a line from a movie. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real, and it reached the part of Brendan that still believed. In friendship, Brendan nodded, just once, then they walked out together. The audience didn't cheer. They stood quietly, respectfully. Brendan took the chair next to Keanu, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt safe. And as the cameras rolled, he smiled not because he had to, but because someone had waited in silence, just to remind him he mattered. The silence between words lights felt softer, not because they had changed, but because Brendan Fraser was no longer alone under them. He sat beside Keanu Reeves, their chairs side by side, a quiet distance between them that didn't feel empty. It felt safe. The moderator welcomed them again, this time with more care in his voice. The audience waited. Not one person checked their phone. Not one cough broke the stillness. Something unspoken had happened, and everyone felt it. Brendan cleared his throat softly. He looked into the crowd, then at the camera, and then down at his own lap. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say," he whispered. Keanu smiled without turning his head. "Then say nothing," he replied. "Just be here." The moderator tried to guide the conversation back to the original questions about their early careers. Favorite memories, the indie film they had done together back in the 90s. But Brendan kept drifting off. His eyes would fall on something. Far away, his mind pulled back into darker times. Keanu never interrupted. He just listened. Whenever Brendan paused, unsure or uneasy, Keanu waited. And in that space between silence and speech, Brendan began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Permission to be real? "Can I tell a story?" Brendan asked suddenly, his voice shaky. The moderator nodded, but Keanu didn't need to. His quiet presence had already said yes. Brendan took a deep breath. "There was a time," began, "when I would walk into a room and everyone wanted something from me. A photo, a quote, a smile." He paused. "But not my truth. Never that." The audience leaned in. "I was in pain," he continued. "Physical, emotional, all of it. And I kept pretending. For years," he laughed bitterly. "I thought if I just kept smiling, people wouldn't notice I was disappearing." His hands fidgeted in his lap. "But then one day, I just stopped showing up." The room was completely silent. No shifting, no whispers. Even the camera crew looked shaken. Brendan wasn't acting. This wasn't a comeback story with scripted lines. This was a man remembering how it felt to be forgotten. Deciding to speak anyway, "I disappeared," he said again, softer now. "And no one came looking." Keanu turned toward him finally. "I did," he said. Brendan blinked for a moment. It looked like he didn't understand. Then the memory came rushing back. A single message. Years ago, a time when he had shut off his phone for days, but when he finally checked it, there it was. "Hey, I don't know what you're going through, but I hope you know you're not alone. If you ever need anything, I'm here." Brendan had never replied. He had stared at that message for an hour, phone trembling in his hand, and cried. And now, all these years later, here he was sitting beside the man who had sent it. The moderator wiped his eyes discreetly. A woman in the second row held her breath, afraid even that would break the moment. Brendan looked at Keanu and whispered, "Why?" Keanu smiled. "Because no one stood for me once," he said. "And I remember how that felt." His voice was steady, not loud, not dramatic, but it carried more weight than any award speech. Brendan looked down again, and this time, when his eyes filled with tears, he didn't hide them. "I wish more people were like you," he whispered. Keanu shrugged gently. "I think more people want to be," he said. "They just don't know how." Brendan wiped his face, nodded, and turned back to the audience, and then, for the first time, he smiled like he meant it. Not because someone told him to, not because he felt obligated, but because something had begun to heal. After the panel, the two men walked backstage together. Reporters rushed to the front for interviews. But Keanu lifted a quiet hand. "Not tonight," he said simply. Brendan exhaled with relief, and together, they stepped outside into the cool evening air, away from the lights, away from the noise, to men walking slowly. Side by side, Keanu didn't ask what Brendan was feeling. He didn't need to. Sometimes kindness is loud, but sometimes it's just walking at someone's pace. A small crew member, maybe no older than 22, stood nearby watching them. He had headphones slung around his neck and eyes filled with emotion. Brendan noticed. He walked over and gently asked, "You okay?" The young man nodded quickly, then shook his head. "My dad. He loved you," he said. "You were his favorite. When he passed, we used to watch your movies to remember him." Brendan didn't speak. He just reached out, pulled the young man into a hug, and whispered, "Thank you for telling me." Behind them, Keanu smiled. And in that moment, It was clear this wasn't just about a film festival anymore. This was about remembering what it meant to be seen not as stars, not as actors, but as humans. The echo of old wounds seed next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Brendan Fraser breaks silence in emotional return. Keanu Reeves' quiet gesture moves audience to tears. Real friendship in Hollywood still exists. Photos of them sitting side by side had flooded social media. No filters, no flashy poses, just raw truth. But what the world saw was only the surface. What they didn't know was what came after. Brendan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the hotel window, watching the city lights flicker across the canal. His phone buzzed over and over again. Messages from fans, producers, old friends, but he didn't open them. Instead, he kept replaying Keanu's voice in his head. I did. Those two words had cracked something open inside him. It had been years since someone said, I saw you without needing something in return. And now, for the first time in forever, Brendan wasn't thinking about his broken career or the people who had left. He was thinking about healing. But healing was not easy. He stared at the mirror. Across the room, his reflection didn't lie. There were lines where smiles used to live. Scars, some visible, some not. His fingers touched the faint mark on his hand from an old surgery. And he whispered to himself, You survived. The following day, they were both invited to a private studio for an in-depth interview. Just the two of them. Brendan hesitated. His heart raced again. But Keanu simply said, I'll go if you go. So they went. The room was small, cozy. 2 armchairs, a camera in the corner, no audience. Just two men and the weight of what they carried. The host wasn't there to pry. She greeted them gently, offered tea, and said, No questions you don't want to answer. We were just talking today. Brendan nodded, grateful. The recording light blinked on. Keanu leaned back, calm as always. But this time, it was Brendan who spoke first. I think I used to pretend a lot, he said. In movies? The host asked. Brendan shook his head. In life. He looked at Keanu, and something in his eyes softened. You know what it's like, he said, to smile when your heart's breaking. Keanu gave a slow nod. Yeah, he said. I know that silence. And the loneliness, Brendan added. And the nights that feel endless, Keanu whispered. There was a pause. Then Brendan leaned forward. Can I tell them? He asked Keanu. Keanu didn't ask what. He just nodded, and Brendan spoke. Years ago, Brendan said, I was at my lowest. My body was falling apart. My career was gone. One night I was ready to end everything. The host went still. Keanu didn't move. Brendan continued, his voice cracking. I had a note, had a plan, and then I got one text. No fanfare. No judgment. Just one sentence from someone who hadn't spoken to me in years. He looked straight at the camera now. You're not alone. Took a deep breath. That message saved my life. Keanu blinked, quiet, humble, and deeply moved. Brendan smiled weakly. You never knew that, did you? Keanu shook his head. I just thought you needed a friend, he said. I did, Brendan replied. And you were. The host gently asked, What do you want people to take away from this? Brendan sat in silence for a moment. Then he said that kindness doesn't need an audience. He looked over at Keanu, and that sometimes the people who save you do it quietly. Keanu smiled faintly. And they don't always know they saved you, he said. The host turned off the camera. No one spoke for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because something sacred had just happened, and no one wanted to rush past it. As they left the studio, Brendan stopped outside the door. You were the only one who saw me back then, he said. Keanu looked at him. Gently, because you saw me too, he replied. Brendan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Keanu hesitated. Then he said something he hadn't said out loud in years. After I lost her, I shut down. Brendan knew what her meant. The love Keanu had lost years ago. The grief that never made. Headlines, the heartbreak that followed him. Quietly from set to set, Keanu didn't explain more. He didn't have to. Brendan reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm glad you stayed, he whispered. Me too, Keanu replied. And for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel broken. They just felt human that night. Neither of them posted anything on social media. No stories, no tweets, just a quiet dinner together. No scripts, no fans, just two men who had walked through fire and never let each other burn alone. The letter he never sent a week later. The interview had gone viral, not because of drama, it's because of scandal, but because it was real. Thousands of people commented about the moment. Brendan spoke his truth, how he almost gave up. How? One quiet message from Keanu had pulled him back. Fans weren't just watching anymore. They were writing in. People shared their own stories, their battles with depression, their quiet victories. Loved ones who saved them without ever knowing it, and across the world, something unexpected happened. People started sending silent thank yous to those who had once stood by them, even without words. But what no one knew was that Brendan had written his own letter too. He just hadn't sent it yet. He sat in his hotel room again. Same window, same view of the Venetian Canal. The world was celebrating him now, calling it his comeback. But it didn't feel like that. Not to him. It felt like something was still unfinished. So he opened his notebook, the one he always carried but rarely used. He stared at the blank page. Then, slowly, he began to write. Dear Keanu, I was never going to tell you this, but maybe it's time. Years ago when I disappeared, I wanted to vanish, not just from Hollywood, not just from the screen, but from life. Your message didn't fix everything, but reminded me that someone still cared. Someone who didn't want anything from me. Someone who remembered me not as a meme, not as a has-been, but as a person. You saved me, and now that I've said it out loud, I realize something even more powerful. I want to be that kind of person too. For someone else, just like you were for me. Thank you. Brendan closed the notebook. He didn't send it. He didn't need to. Some things don't need to be read. They just need to be written. That same night, Keanu was walking through the quiet streets of Rome. He had taken a short trip after the festival alone. As he often did, he liked the silence, the anonymity. People passed him on the street and did double takes. But they didn't stop him. He moved. Like someone who didn't want attention. He found a small corner cafe with warm lights and sat down. He ordered coffee and just sat, thinking, remembering. He didn't know about the letter Brendan had written. But somehow, in his heart, he felt something had shifted. He had spent so many years giving, so many years carrying others' pain. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt something return, not fame, not praise, but a quiet kind of love, from someone who had once been broken and now stood taller, all stronger. Not because the world forgave him, but because someone saw him when he couldn't see himself. A few days later, Brendan visited a small college campus, not for a film shoot, not for publicity, just to speak. He had been invited by a student group that had watched his interview and reached out. They didn't expect him to reply, but he did. When he walked into the lecture hall, students stood. They didn't cheer, they just clapped softly. One student near the back wiped tears before Brendan even said a word. He took the mic, looked out at the room and said, I don't have advice, but I do have a story. And then he told them everything. About the silence, about the fall, about the man who reached out and didn't give up. The students didn't ask for autographs afterward. They just hugged him that night. Brendan sent one message to Keanu. No emojis. No long paragraphs. Just one line. You didn't just save me. You gave me the strength to save others. Keanu didn't reply immediately. He didn't have to, because hours later, Brendan's phone lit up. It was a photo, a small folded note in Keanu's handwriting. It read, Then the world just got better, one quiet voice at a time. The next day, producer called them both. He offered a new film, not a big-budget action movie, not a flashy franchise, just a simple story, too. A quiet journey, and a message the world needed to hear. Brendan hesitated, but this time he didn't. Fraser looked over at Keanu, and Keanu just said, Let's tell the truth, even if no one's ready for it. Brendan nodded. Yeah, let's tell it. The truth they chose to tell film was unlike anything either of them had done before. No explosions, no heroes in capes, no glossy edits to hide the cracks. It was called The Bench. Two strangers meet on a park bench over 6 days. One is tired of life, the other simply listens. That's it. That was the story. No twists, no action, just conversation. Silence, memory, grief, and healing. And that's why Brendan said yes. Because it felt like his story. It felt like their story. On the first day of filming, the crew noticed something unusual. Keanu didn't bring an assistant. Brendan didn't ask. For special treatment, they sat together for hours before the cameras rolled, talking quietly, not about the script, but about life, about little moments, about things they'd never shared with anyone. Keanu opened up about the time he stood at his sister's hospital bedside for 3 nights straight, afraid to close his eyes. Brendan spoke about the moment he realized his son might never speak in full sentences, but still had more heart than anyone he knew. They didn't need to rehearse the script, because it wasn't acting anymore. It was remembering, and every scene felt like a piece of their real selves being laid bare. The first take of the first scene was only supposed to be a test. Keanu sat on the bench. Brendan walked over slowly, as if unsure whether to sit, and when he finally did, they just sat for a long time. No words, just silence. The director whispered, "Cut." But no one moved. Keanu finally spoke. "You ever feel like the world moves too fast for people like us?" Brendan didn't answer with a line from the script. He just nodded. Double quotes every day. And the director didn't call it acting. He just let the camera roll. The film was shot in under 3 weeks. No studio interference, no forced scenes. The script kept changing, because real emotions don't follow dialogue. One morning, during a rain scene, they sat soaked in their coats. Keanu looked up at the sky and said, "I used to think rain was punishment." Brendan asked, "What do you think now?" Keanu smiled slightly. "I think it's just the sky trying to cry quietly." Brendan looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "That's the line. That's the one." It stayed in the film. Off. Set. Something even more powerful was happening. The crew grips, lights, catering, and turns. They started changing too. A young camera operator told Brendan, "I was going to quit this job. I thought no one in this industry cared." Brendan handed him coffee the next morning without saying a word. A makeup artist broke down during a break and whispered to Keanu, "My brother died last year." No one at work even asked how I was doing. Keanu sat with her in silence for half an hour. Sometimes, just being there is enough. And that's what this set became. Not a production, a space to breathe, a space to be human. A week before the final scene, Brendan stood by the lake near the filming location. He watched ducks float gently across the water. Keanu joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. They didn't speak at first. Then Brendan said, "You think people will watch this?" Keanu thought. "For a moment, maybe," he said. "But even if they don't, we made something true." Brendan sipped his coffee, then asked quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Did you ever regret not doing more blockbusters? Not chasing the spotlight?" Keanu stared at the lake. Double quotes, "No," he said, "because I didn't lose myself." Brendan nodded slowly. "I think I did." He whispered. Keanu looked at him. "You didn't lose yourself," he said. "You were just buried under other people's expectations." Brendan smiled faintly. "You always say the right thing." "No," Keanu said. "I just stopped pretending a long time ago." The final scene was shot at sunrise. The last words of the film were improvised. Brendan's character looked at Keanu's and asked, "Do you think broken people can really be whole again?" And Keanu replied, "I don't think we need to be whole. Just honest." Cut. Silence on set. No applause, just quiet awe. And for the first time, Brendan walked away from a film not feeling used up, but feeling restored. After wrap, the cast and crew gathered for a quiet dinner. No speeches, no awards, just shared looks and nods of respect. The director gave them each a simple thank you card. Inside, Brendan's was a note. You didn't just play the role, you healed it. Inside Keanu's, your silence spoke louder than 1,000 monologues. And both men held those cards like they were more valuable than trophies, because for the first time in a long time, they weren't chasing anything. They had already found what mattered: truth, friendship, and the kind of love that asks for nothing, but gives everything. The awards they never asked for months passed. The film The Bench wasn't advertised like other movies, no giant posters, no loud trailers with explosions, just a quiet clip uploaded online, Brendan and Keanu sitting on that bench in silence. The wind moving softly through the trees, and still, it spread like wildfire. Not because it was trendy, not because it was viral, but because it was true. People watched it late at night, when they felt alone. They watched it after funerals, after breakups, after being told they weren't enough. They watched it not to escape but to feel, and in message boards, comment sections, and personal letters, one phrase kept coming up again and again: "This saved me." The Academy didn't know what to do with the film. It broke every rule. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but when the nominations came out, Best Actor, Brendan Fraser, Best Supporting Actor, Keanu Reeves, Best Original Screenplay, The Bench. Best Picture, The Bench. Brendan laughed when he saw the list. "You think we're really going?" he asked. Keanu shrugged. "If you want to." Brendan smiled, then paused. "What if we lose?" Keanu looked at him. "We already won," he said. On the night of the awards, Brendan wore a suit he had owned for 10 years. Keanu wore black, simple. As always, they arrived together, not with bodyguards, not in a limousine, just in a quiet sedan driven by the same assistant who had worked with them on the bench. Brendan looked out the window as the cameras flashed ahead. "I used to hate this," he admitted. "You don't have to do it," Keanu said. But Brendan shook his head. "No, this time I want to." He stepped out, and for the first time in years, he didn't fake a smile. He didn't play a role. He just stood tall and walked beside his friend. During the ceremony, they didn't sit in the front row. They asked to sit near the middle, closer to the crew. Keanu had told the organizers, and when Brendan's name was announced for Best Actor, he didn't stand up right away. He froze, not out of fear, but because he was overwhelmed, not by the crowd, not by the lights, but by the memory of the man who had stood beside him backstage. No one else did. He turned to Keanu, and Keanu just nodded. Brendan stood up, and the entire room followed. On stage, Brendan didn't read from a card. He didn't talk about movies. He didn't talk about talent. He'd said one thing: "I thought my story was over." Turns out, it was just quiet for a while. He looked down at Keanu. "Thank you for waiting through." The silence. The applause wasn't loud, it was long, and it was real. After the awards, they left early. No after-dash parties. No speeches. Just two men walking through the back alley behind the theater. "Want to get pancakes?" Brendan asked. Keanu laughed. "Absolutely." They found a small diner. No one recognized them. They sat in a corner booth, just like they used to when they were both younger, broke, and full of dreams. Brendan looked down at the award on the table and said, "I don't need this." Keanu sipped his coffee. "Then give it to someone who does." So Brendan did the next day. He mailed it to that same college student group that had invited him to speak, with a note: "For anyone who ever felt forgotten, this is yours." In the years that followed, The Bench became more than a movie. It became a movement. Schools showed it in classes about empathy. Counselors recommended it to people struggling with grief and depression, and in a world that was growing noisier, the film whispered gently, "You're not alone." Brendan Fraser didn't return to blockbusters. He didn't need to. He started writing small books, quiet reflections, stories that reminded people it was okay to feel lost. As long as you kept walking, Keanu Reeves kept acting. But more carefully now. He chose roles not for the fame, but for the message. They still saw each other often. No cameras, no red carpets, just walks, Long conversations, and sometimes silence, because that's where it all began. And in that silence, something had bloomed. Just a friendship, but a reminder to the world. Kindness doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be real.